Good morning, and welcome to Playable Worlds. It's great to have you guys with us again. We are doing another one in our series of dev interviews. And this one's fun for me because for this time, I get to interview my boss. Yay! This is Eric Goldberg. I'm going to ask him to introduce himself and his role at Playable Worlds.
Thanks, Rick. I will definitely give you a better performance review for anything nice that you say to me. Uh, uh, so, uh, so I started the company. I'm the co-founder with Ralph Coster. We had our initial discussions about this in September of 2018 and had an agreement in principle in 2019. Sorry, in November of 2018, and then we actually raised the money to be able to hire people in May of 2019. Raph and I wanted to do this because there's a convergence of things that we wanted to do in our various careers in online. Raph, as many of you know, started with Diku Mud around 1991 or 1992, so he's a 33, 34-year veteran. I did my first online game work back when dinosaurs roamed the internet, starting in 1982 with the CBS AT&T video text trial, which was notable in that it used a standard called Maplips, which is a Canadian standard that allowed you to do primitive graphics when everything else had always been only text. So I've been doing online games for now 43 years. It was sometime in May, so I'm going to claim it was before May 22nd. So I can claim 43 years of service. Um, I, I designed the first online game to draw 1 million players, which was Mad Maze for the now long gone Prodigy online service. I will
I
say that
remember Prodigy. Yeah.
uh,
Wow.
Uh, well, actually, which iteration of Prodigy is the question because Prodigy ended up being CBS AT&T. The CBS AT&T trial became an IBM Sears CBS joint venture, which became Prodigy. Then CBS drops out. So the original, but they knew that Mad Maze had been a hit. It had actually been at one point one half of all service usage on a Thanksgiving weekend, which nearly brought the service down because it's useful to have a fun game when everything else in the service is pretty boring. This makes you look very very good. In any event, just briefly, I've been doing online games. However, it's important to note that while my second company, Crossover Technologies, was one of the earliest on the internet, I chose a dead end thread where I did MadBase, which was the consumer online services, which included CompuServe, AOL, which was originally Quantum, and so on and so forth, which of course had everything swept before it by the internet. And while I did a number of internet games or produced a number of internet games in the 1990s, um, I didn't do anything that was as lasting as, for instance, RAF achieved with Ultima Online in 1997. Just briefly, the rest of my history. I started as a game designer. I was fortunate that SBI, which was a military simulation, in other words, a war game company, offered me a job as a designer just before I turned 17, and ruined me for life because I thought about this briefly, get paid to design games, get not paid to go to school. My attendance drops off, and I become a more or less full-time game designer. The best thing about the first simulation game I did, which was on the German campaign in the Balkans through to Crete, the Paradrop on Crete in 1941, um, is that it's out of print, and my rookie mistakes can only be purchased by people who really hunt hard for it on eBay. I got a little bit better than that. Um, by the time I was 24, I had produced the third of three games that won Best Role Playing Game of the Year for the Origins Award in the field. And ones that still survive today, that are available include include the Paranoia role playing game, which has I did the original role-playing game. The computer game I was involved with, but I was not the designer. The board game I think is a lot of fun, but that was just I was playing as a licensor, and that was a co-design. Another one that was that I did, which was still out, which was done both as a computer and a board game, was Tales of the Arabian Nights, for which the 40th anniversary edition will come out later this year, assuming that they can get it to the U.S. underneath before the tariff window with China closes. Um, that actually had a sequel come out, Tales of the Arthurian Knights, spelled Kinghts, in December, which was a sequel 39 years after first publication of the base game. If, by the way, the cadence for sequels is every 39 years, I will not be around for the next interview, Rick. You may be, but I won't.
Understood.
But
No,
forgive me for not showing up because I've shuffled off this mortal coil. Moving forward,
exactly.
um,
As we
I
call it, I'll have one Eve at that point. Yes. Yeah.
and I
So,
look forward to seeing your winning spreadsheet, which will be a thing of beauty in the Smithsonian Institution. Okay, so uh, I make the progression from designer to producer and then head of R&D at West End Games, which was the first. It was a restartup rather than a startup, and we grew that from nothing. The most notable things, aside from paranoia, is that I and Greg Kostikian won the right in a spirited competition to the first non-Lucasfilm Star Wars game, which was a Star Wars role-playing game, which also won Best Role-Playing Game of the Year. That's Greg's design. I was just the producer on that one. From West End Games, I go to Crossover Technology. I start Crossover Technologies. I'm the CEO there. It was a consumer online company. It ran for 11 years, had a moderately decent exit. Next, I do Unplugged Games, which was started in 2000, which was one of the very first mobile game companies. This was back when everybody knew, in quotes, that no one would ever play games on a mobile phone because no one would ever want to play on a screen that small. It unfortunately is the one startup I had that did not work out. We had a Series A financing, that is, venture capital financing, due for September 18th, 2001 in New York City, which is not the best timing I've ever had in my career. Um, move forward for the next 15 years after that, whether I was called an advisor or a board member, it was usually with venture-backed companies. One third were large companies like Electronic Arts and Goldman Sachs and places like that. But most of them were venture-backed, consumer-facing companies. Um, as I put it, in years that companies I was working with had an exit, I was smart. In years that companies that did not have an exit, I was dumb. Had more smart years than dumb years, so that worked out. And then I'm probably most proud of one that was an eight-figure exit. That is, in the middle tens of millions rather than the hundreds of millions, which was called Story Toys, which is now part of Team 17. They did kids apps, which is a really hard field. They are now actually killing it. In fact, they probably sold for too little because they've got a combination of quality and brands. I started doing a lot of work in kids apps and ed tech in 2008 because that was when that would, and it is not a coincidence that my oldest child was born in September 2007. So I did that for about 10, 11 years, and then pretty much stopped doing stuff with ed tech and kids apps in 2018. I decided that by then I had two children. I decided that they were well launched and I could just concentrate on Playable Worlds. In any event,
good.
short versions, I made the migration. I made the migration from designer, game designer, to the useless overhead I am today.
I do want to draw a complaint, though, at the line "just a producer" on the other game. Producers are
Uh,
super important. Producers hold the sky up, dude, as you know.
okay, so English is my first language, even though you pointed out why people might doubt that. I meant I was just a producer, meaning not a producer and a designer.
Yeah.
Producers are extraordinarily valuable. Otherwise, designers designers' ideas. Designers are the cats who need to be herded, and producers are the cat herders for designers, for artists, for engineers. They have a really tough job, and
Yeah.
I greatly appreciate Rod Haza, who you chased away before this interview, who basically holds things together over here. Gordon Walton, who was our EP, who got us to the point where we were able to be able to launch the
Yeah.
pre-alpha. Dave Georgeson, who has done a very good job into stepping into it. Can I name check every producer I've ever worked with? It'll use the rest of the
No,
interview.
no, 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 no. We actually have a different subject to address today. But first, let's give a little bit of context. Actually, yeah, and if we have time, we'll do some more fun stuff here at the end. But look, I want to talk a little bit about GamesBeat Summit 2025. Let's explain what it is. Well, actually, you help us. What is this event and who attends it? I was
All right.
like, bad timing.
First off, the GamesBeat, which you can Google, it's gamesbeat.com, is probably the foremost the foremost American games journalism site. It tells you about it is business oriented, so it tells you about companies and their numbers, but what it really concentrates on is what games are involved, what games are being produced. For instance, is Grand Theft Auto going to be delayed? Um, what's new and interesting? They'll do articles. They've done a number of articles for which we are grateful on Playable Worlds.
Yeah,
It is headed
amen.
by Dean. It is headed by Dean Takahashi, who is the dean, I guess pun intended, of American games business journalists. He was covering this in the late 1990s and did an enormous service for the field by making sure that Wall Street finally understood how the games business worked. Remember, it was a small business when he started, under a couple tens of billions. Now it's 180 to 200 billion, depending on whose numbers you believe worldwide. In any event, the GamesBeat conference, which occurs twice a year, is one that is usually somewhere between 600 and 800 people. It's industry professionals. It is a series of panels. For example, I may have done one I may have done one which was on the game's new normal, which we can talk about in a moment. But there were other ones on, for instance, how to, the state of the art in live ops, how to deal with, deal with representation for minorities in the field. Um, what are
Artificial
the,
intelligence, how
so
to
I was
use,
going to
yeah.
say, I was going to say, Rick, you can answer you know what the answers are going to be because you attended that. But there were of course more panels on AI and either what you can do with AI in production tools, what types of games are possible with AI. And I thought the best panels were the ones who said, we have no expletive deleted clue about what AI will be able to make. There was actually a session where three or four of the best, some of the smartest business people in the field, being Gordon, who launched the John Madden line for EA, Owen Mahoney, who is the president of Nexon, um, and Mitch Lasky, who's the most successful U.S. venture capitalist in games, debated whether they had 10% confidence in their predictions about what AI games would make possible, 5%, or near zero. And Bing was the most confident at 10. Mitch was the least confident at 0.
Nice, 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 nice.
But
But
the other
yeah,
thing I
the
should
people,
sorry, Rick. The other thing I should mention is I failed to do a complete answer when I did the diversions of GamesBeat. It is also, if you want to get together with a subsection of particularly the West Coast people which is the epicenter of games in the U.S., who are doing things in games, both startups and business people, um, but more startups and people who actually care about doing products. It's one of the best conferences to go. Obviously, you'll see these people at Game Developers Conference, but this is something where it's intimate and 600 to 800 people. So the possibilities for useful conversations sparking are much higher than when it's 15 to 30,000 on the streets of San Francisco. Sorry to interrupt. You had a next question.
That's a very good point. Yeah. Also, the average job title is somewhat higher at this smaller, a little bit more exclusive event than GDC has everything from beginners to CEOs and emeritus. It's got everything.
Well, actually, it's not as true. You're seeing people with quote lower level titles or more production oriented titles because of the reset or the reckoning or the whatever euphemism you prefer for the tens of thousands of layoffs we've had. People go and catch free badges. And one thing that the GamesBeat organization, I should give them great credit for, is they make it relatively easy to get a free or discounted badge. Maybe you have to do service, like the equivalent of a conference associate. But if you have a plausible story, or if you're just having a hard time, they will comp you, even though they will have people who are executives of companies pay something close to full price. So, but I saw this at DICE, where a lot of people showed up to be conference adjacent. They wouldn't pay the price. Well, that's several $1,000s, so they
Yeah.
wouldn't pay the price.
Yeah.
EDC, the same thing. They might not pay for a badge to go into it, but they wanted to be able to buttonhole and meet people and go to the free networking events. And GamesBeat doesn't quite do it at the same level, but I would guess there were 100, 150 people who actually make games who were there.
Yeah. So we're talking to our peers in this. This is not a consumer event. And the premise of one particular talk was how to make the best of the new normal in games after all these layoffs and all this resetting and all this capital evaporated and so on. And Eric and Mitch Lasky presented it on stage together. And I thought it was the best session of the conference. Uh, People were
Um,
hanging on every word. It was amazing.
Rick,
What?
thank you.
Yeah.
You're already getting a good performance review. You don't have to promote.
No.
People will be able to see it on video and decide whether it worked. I'd put it a little bit differently. We advertised in the session description that we were going to offer perspectives on the new normal that you hadn't heard as much
Yeah.
as possible, and then offer ways out of the box. Should I just do a brief setup on
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
we are?
Please do. Please do.
Okay, so uh, games. When I came into games 40 years ago, it was at under $250 million enterprise worldwide. Now, back then, $250 million was worth, in terms of purchasing power, it was worth more like 2 or 3 billion. But let's just go with that number because now it is, as we mentioned earlier, 180 to $200 billion business. I've been fortunate to be in a period where there's been nearly 1,000-fold growth in the size of the field. It has been one of constant expansion. Yes, there have been hiccups like 1988, 89. The field did have a problem, but basically we've seen constant growth, constant expansion, and games have gone from a niche played by geeks like me, almost exclusively. In the US, it passed the 50% mark, where 50% of the population played games, whether or not they identified themselves as a game player, in 2009 or 2010. And now games are a mass medium that almost anyone who is a child growing up in the United States today, or Canada or Mexico, will end up playing games. We had in 2020, 2021, the 12-month period between, after the pandemic had started to mid 2021, and then 21 to 22, we had 15 and 20% growth, respectively. You don't see this in $100 billion industries. We went from 130, 135 billion to the present day 180 to 200 billion. It is, I won't say it's unprecedented, but it's highly unusual. However, there was a highly unusual event. We locked people in their houses for a 2-year period, and so they had more time to play games. One of the things that I did in early 2022 is I said this growth was not going to continue. and that the fourth quarter of 2022 would be as little as a 0% growth. A number of people said, "Oh, that's Eric just being pessimistic again," which I certainly have been in the past. But it was an easy prediction for me to make because you were going to see the growth stop when people got let out of the house. And then they wanted to spend time doing all the things they hadn't done before, hanging out at the mall, playing contact sports, et cetera, and so forth. So it dropped. Um, the first warning signs that maybe I knew what I was talking about came when Microsoft Games put a freeze on hiring in July of 2022. And then Nexon followed, Korea followed very quickly. So at the same time, in the previous 2 years, there had been an absolute flood of venture capital. I mean, a huge amount by people who are not experienced investors. And at the same time, the large companies from Microsoft Games through to NetEase and Tencent of China all also overinvested. Sorry, they invested optimistically. Let's put it more nicely. The net result is for anyone who's heard me speak before, I pointed out about 25 years ago, two things kill early stage companies and projects. One is too little money. You run out of money. Of course, you're going to have an issue. But the other is too much money. We have a problem. We have a problem with too much money, and the industry has been suffering for it. So let's look at what's happened since then. Since late 2022 to 2025, the industry has gone from 0%. Actually, there are people who claim that it was negative 4.5% in that December 2022. And pretty much it's had some growth, but pretty low. And then we've had a giant hangover from all the money and all the projects, all the money that got deployed and all the projects that got set up. So those of you who did, I think even those of you who don't follow the business know that many famous and accomplished studios have been shut down or basically their staff has been eviscerated. The industry has let go, I believe it's a total of 40,000 people over the last 20 months. And the industry actually, I use the analogy in the talk that Rick referenced, that it looks like the grocery business with better margins. If you look at the bestseller lists in almost any category, mobile, AAA PC games, and so on, the same names keep appearing on the list. That may not be the same games, but you will see Call of Duty 46, Grand Theft Auto 67, et cetera, and so forth. You may see a different game, but it will have the Lord of the Rings name on it or the Star Wars name on it. In other words, there have only been, Mitch quoted this, there have only been since 2020 one or two new titles to break into the top 15 list. That is, I used to describe this when this occurred in mobile in the mid 2000s as the steepness of the success pyramid. I rather like the more simpler, basically the bestseller list has become a moat. This is not good for the health of the industry.
And the two that did break in were both from first party console makers. So not from not from regular medium-sized developers. These were massive people with huge advantages and everything going for them to be able to get in there. Yeah,
On
very
the
tough.
PC list, that's correct. But to give a ray of hope, Pal World, which made an appearance there, and Balatro both came out of Balatro came out of a one-man band and briefly hit the list and is still selling very, very well. Pal World out of a relatively small Japanese firm where there were a bunch of people who were crazy in the best possible way to be able to put it in. Yeah, but again, I'm splitting hairs by saying, wait, here's the exception that doesn't that proves the rule. The other thing that's happened, which is difficult, is for years, for most of the 40 years, when the Game Developers Conference started in 1988, and it was called the Computer Game Developers Conference. there was a certain amount of styling that Silicon Valley was the the Florence, just was to the computer game industry what Florence was to the Renaissance. And for years it's been, Americans lead the world. Okay, when Canada gave all the great tax breaks, Montreal became the center, the largest center of game development in North America. But basically, still North America is the center. Cue the rise of China, Korea, China, and Japan, and cue the globalization of the project. There's an excellent Dean Takahashi article written about 5, 6 years about that uses some title like "The World is Flat" after the Thomas Friedman book at that point. But now there is a problem for American and even Western European developers. The rest of the world has acquired good game development skills, and they're cheaper. So on top of all this, this contraction in the field, and basically all the money and the projects going to the best, the established titles already. Add to that Westerners have become too expensive. So there's been a lot of unhappiness. I should do a shout out to Amir Satvat, who has done a marvelous job about trying to make sure that there are resources for people to get replaced and retrained, providing emotional support. One other thing for context, because there's a lot of stuff that we're bringing in over here. Mitch Lasky, who we've mentioned several times, is the most successful VC in games in North America. His successes include the Series A, that is, being one of the earliest investors in Riot Games, which is League of Legends, so that was a huge outcome. Gaikai, which became the Sony streaming service. Again, he was early stage on that. That game company, which is killing it in China. I mean, they're one of the few foreign companies to do consistently good results. He's done Discord, which is our host, and for which we thank you. We have to thank Discord. And then when he went slumming outside of games, he was an early investor in Twitter. That one did really well for him. And he was an early investor in Snapchat. That one also did really well for him.
Yeah.
So,
do you want to pause and take a question from the channel? Jehu81 is asking, do you see another 1984 style crash on the horizon? I remember cartridges being buried in landfills at that point. Yeah.
Just for context, in 1983, Atari overproduced. So when E.T., which was then one of the biggest grossing films of all time, Atari overproduced by several millions copies of a crappy E.T. game, but they figured it was licensed. Things were big. They ended up, as Rick referred, burying a couple million somewhere in the New Mexico desert. But more importantly, what happened was the Atari console, which becoming an early sign of a mass market, turned out to be too early in a false spring. The answer is I don't see a crash like that occurring again. Games, in the late 20th century, several of the 1990s GDCs, some other conferences, I observed that games were going to be the medium of the 21st century because they are a perfect marriage with the computer. The reason we're not going to have something that looks strictly like the 1980s one is games, the Atari console thing, which was a huge business, I forget the exact size, but it was the equivalent of several $1 billion, was a fad. At this point, games are not a fad. They are very much part of our culture. In fact, they are arguably bigger than books, which I consider a tragedy because I'm a bookaholic. I enjoy reading books. They are almost as much a part of our culture as the other big, not as the other big two, music, films, and TV. So no, I don't see a crash like that. I do, however, see something now. Here's something interesting, actually. There is another contender that did not occur to me when I was saying games was going to be the art form of the 21st century. So when I projected that games were going to be a huge business and continue to be a huge business in 2020, crash, I missed something. It's always important to acknowledge the things you miss when you're making prognostications. Because people have been playing games so assiduously from 2020 to 2022 while locked in their home, games got to be a larger part of the entertainment budget, the amount of time that people spent playing games. And because of that, I think that that's another insurance and moat against the 1980s style crash occurring. However, one thing, and this ties into the thing about the 21st century art form I missed, the thing that has got even more usage than games are short videos, TikTok style
Yeah.
videos. And there is an interesting thing that, well, the amount of time being spent on games went into retrograde. That is, it is descending on average as of somewhere around 2023, 2024. The levels are still much higher than 2019, but it may be that games have hit a peak and are dropping, or it may be, as Mitch and then I said on stage, it may be because we are the companies have become so risk averse because they want to do GTA 67 and Call of Duty 46. They basically try and do the same game and pump it out with huge production values and huge budgets. And players are saying, what's new? I'm just getting the same experience. I like the same experience, but I'd like to try something different. So there is an argument, and this is a longer discussion than we have time for. There is an argument that the games field is not producing enough new experiences, is not producing enough diversity and variety to hold people against movies and TV, which are having a huge renaissance of that, and short form videos, which will provide diversity to make sure that it keeps getting your attention. So necessarily will keep producing new stuff. At the same time, it gives you the comfort stuff, but it will produce the new stuff because it wants to make sure that if you're an adolescent male and you get tired of ogling pretty girls, or if you're oriented a different way, pretty boys, that you will end up having something new to see what else we might use to get the dopamine hit and get you captured in. The games now have an issue. I don't believe I do not believe there will be a crash, as your questioner asked, but I could see there being a correction, and I could see the games industry making sure that the correction is larger than it should have been.
Okay. At the conference on Tuesday, which was only 2 days ago, I can't believe this, you presented on how game companies should navigate the new normal of this ever-changing industry. And it wasn't
Game game companies or game companies, small game developers. Which ones do you want me to take?
oh yeah.
What type of game company?
Let's
Because
let's
we just
specifically say small game developers like us, because I think now the players are going to find this interesting regardless, whichever direction you pick. But normally they don't see behind the curtain all the way. They'll see the tours, the chocolate factory tours, but they don't see all the stuff in the back that they don't want you to see. Let's give them a glimpse behind the curtain a little bit about a little bit how rough it is right now, but let's try to be optimistic like you were on Tuesday and not 100% doom and gloom. Let's show them some glimpses of light out as
oh
we
no.
can.
So no, this is not going to be a. It's too late for me. Save yourself. And we were pretty careful, and we were pretty clear in the description. We wanted to do practical results. So the received wisdom. What happens is after the games industry did not want to acknowledge that we were going through a period of of resources suddenly getting very limited after they had been given out like candy on Halloween, and people have had to deal with a lot less resource than they had previously. So the received wisdom, oh, it's good. It'll force you to be lean and mean and concentrate on a game. That's a nice way of making lemonade out of the lemons that the industry hands you now. You know, the number of reductions, the less resources available, that there's less venture money out there. So a couple things to comment about this. One is, um, while the AAA business and the highly commercial, the mobile side, which is driven by that heads the sensor tower areas, is one in which there isn't much room for a small company because basically the top 15 to 25 or 30 slots are held. There, the innovation and the breakout hits in the industry for small developers are coming from the people who do things. I mentioned Balatro, I mentioned Palworld. There is some wonderful innovation going on. I would recommend you follow Greg Kostikian, who posts on LinkedIn rather much about indies. Um, Osama Darius. There are a lot of people who do comments on what's out there in indies. There's this thriving culture, and it can be things like games for people who are not white males, white or Asian males. There could, in other words, it's a whole diversity. There's a huge audience for that. There's some real innovation. There's a huge concentration on doing storytelling and doing ones that are dramatic. It's nice to see that even the big guys, things are dealing with pathos and real human emotions. We're actually finally fulfilling the electronic ads. The Electronic Arts ad promise of 1983. Can a game make you cry? We're finally getting to that, and we're getting great narrative. You look at something like Baldur's Gate 3. I would call Larian, which published that,
Yeah.
to be a mid-sized publisher. And
Yeah.
that was just by having several people run at the absolute top of their craft. I will give a shout out to Lawrence Schick, who
Yeah.
wrote the first independent, non-TSR produced Dungeons and Dragons adventure back in the early 1980s, who was the lore master for Elder Scrolls Online. Lawrence can do a hell of a lot. Is a great scripter, understands how to do things in games. I mentioned my Tales of the Arabian Nights. I have to thank Lawrence. In 1985, the reason it won one of the Best of the Year award, it did, was partly because Lawrence advocated for so strongly. He has taken the insights I had then and the replayable versions and taken it to a whole new level in the intervening 30s. Well, let's see, given when he started on Baldur's Gate, 37 years. So there's a lot of room. There's a lot of room for innovation. You don't have to have sales like Grand Theft Auto, or even like Final Fantasy, to have a very nice business. I mean, again, you don't necessarily have a gearing like Balatro has, where it's one guy and he's making money hand over fist, and he's actually quite a charming story. He was at Game Developers Conference, walking around, and he did not want people to know he was the designer of one of the smash hits of last year. He would just say, "Hi, I'm a developer from," I forget what country he was from, and he would not say what he'd done or what he put together. That's a one-man band delivering a bestseller that's going to have legs. It's not going to be a one and done, which most titles are out there. So again, one of the things that I like is this is still a business. This is still a field. Let me not say business or industry. It's still a field where you can follow your passion.
Yeah.
One of my standard lines, which I used earlier, is that I made the progression from designer to useless overhead. That's because I started as a designer. I care about being games. I'm very pleased whenever I get a chance to do game design. There have to be strict rules of Playable Worlds because I am a designer and I have had evidence of talent, but I am spending the majority of my time doing non-game stuff, business development, corporate development. I can propose, but Raf, Dave Georgeson, to an individual contractor who has an individual contributor, sorry, I see as contributor, who has no one reporting to them, can tell me, "Thank you for your advice, Eric. That's an interesting suggestion. Now I'm going to do what I'm going to do." And it's a very important discipline. Um, they're not going to be able to prevent me from saying, "Here's how you can make it better," but they do have the privilege of ignoring me because I am not doing it full time. And to go back to Greg Kostikian, who I mentioned as someone who you want to follow if you care about indie games, he said to me many years ago, we had worked together on many projects. On a project, you could be the designer and I can be the developer. or I can be the designer, you can be the developer. If you are not one of those two things, then you have to defer to my prerogative so I can do my job of designing the best possible game or developing the best possible game. Aside from the fact that we know each other so well that we have the familiarity that leads to contempt, it was good advice and it's something that you have to do. So back to what people could do. One, this is the most thing, find your passion and by the way, find your passion about a game you want to do. Two, your passion could be, I want a game that makes big bucks that is not obvious out there. For God's sake, do not compete directly with Call of Duty or try to do a better Animal Crossing. Try and do something different. If you say there's money in AI in games, which by the way, that's drawing more than 50% of all investment dollars, and I want to do it, even though it's not my first choice, but I think there's an interesting problem. Go for it, because you might, for financially induced reasons, produce an interesting game. You might produce one that's the equivalent of a cow clicker that just catches people, but if you want to succeed, that's a route. I tend to be someone I tend to be driven by two things: games I want to play, and really interesting challenges that involve a new medium. I was one of the first in online games. I mean, I was in 1982, so 4 years after Richard Bartle did the first online game in 1978. Uh, I was very early. I was one of the earliest in mobile games in the U.S. I was not in the world because Europe and East Asia were doing mobile games in the late 1990s. In the U.S., we really only start around 2000, 2001. Early in social games, early in free to play, et cetera, and so forth. So that's one of the things that attracts me. Figure out what attracts you. That's one. Two, do something about figuring out whether there's an audience for it. And not by going to your friends and saying, this is cool, because you corrupt the result. Not doing something because you've read that something's really hot and you should be doing it. Try and do a rough prototype that you can put in front of people who are not going to say, who are not your mother and going to say whatever you do is wonderful, who are not your buddies who enjoy you and don't want to say nasty things. Then make sure that you have, and this is where it starts getting hard. Make sure that you have the discipline. I do apologize. Rick defended the honor of producers. Now let me the part of the field, the discipline that is probably hurting the most is artists, and the reason is there are so many of them. They've gone, the largest percentage of layoffs have been artists, and it's partly because they are regarded as a commodity, which is not fair to the many great artists out there. And it's also because of things like, not ChatGPT, but sorry, why am I
Gen
blanking
AI.
in the middle?
Gen AI.
Thank you. Gen AI, thank you. Gen AI was what I just was having a senior moment over here. But again, they're having stuff that, yes, there are people fiercely defending against the fact that can software create something and disintermediate humans and copyright and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, whenever technology occurs that has evil results, and basically putting artists out of business or diminishing the value of their work, I consider an evil result. But unfortunately, this is going to happen. Some studios are doing it, but basically the only issue is how much are you allowing Gen AI and other tools like that to be able to do that. So get your engineer, get your artist. If you're not one of these already, get the design, but figure out where there's an audience. Figure out there's an audience for it. This is a step that people miss. I learned this lesson the hard way. I wanted to, in 1979, 1980, 1981, do a game for which I had no sympathy for the audience, sympathy for the topic. And I chose a Gothic romance role-playing game. And I read around 15 of them in about a week to 10 days. My mind started to turn to low-grade industrial sludge.
Mush. Yeah.
But I got an idea of how, and I read some stuff, much stuff that was formulaic, and much stuff that was, but some stuff that were actually literary pretensions. So to be fair, and I came up with a full design, the basic rules, and then I got introduced after I'd done this to two of the top literary agents for romances, and there were two fatal flaws that I'd made. One is that At the time, middle-aged women, 30 to 40 something middle-aged women, were the least demographically likely to play games. It's not the case it is now, where they are the biggest player, they are the second largest cohort of Candy Crush Saga, et cetera, and so forth. They didn't. But the other mistake I made is it was a role-playing game where you would play with each other. The heavy consumers of romances at the time were people who did it to project their fantasies onto it. So if you were in bondage, you would read something about a bondage one. If you were into domineering males, you wanted to do it. If you were into co-equals, you would do it. If you were into having a baby fantasies, but the romances you chose were ones that would say something yourself. And you did not tend to reveal this except to your friends when you had comfort and privacy. So I made two fatal errors because I hadn't talked to the audience, even though I had a design that was workable for an audience that didn't exist. So going back to people tried to start in the field, I would say get your crew, identify the thing that you want to go after because you're going to be spending a lot of time with this. Um, Make sure that you have it, do some initial tests to make an audience, even if it's only anecdata by talking to people, your neighbors or friends, because now that it's a mass market, you will be able to find game players by swinging a cat. By the way, I do not recommend anyone harm any cats in the making of your career. And the fourth thing you have to do is make sure you have the staying power. Games are, people want to get into games. I used the grocery analogy earlier. More people want to get into games than into being grocery management. Again, that's something. Grocery management is something that people do because they want a job. Games are doing. You're up against people who love it, who are willing to undercut their services, undersell their services because they want to be in it and be passionate. You had better make sure that you have the stomach for it. Sorry, I'm giving long answers to everything. I know we only have 8, 9 minutes left. So, Rick, back to you.
Okay. So they are chiming in with questions along the way, by the way.
I'll try and give shorter answers.
Cygnus asked, for Mad Maze, what was the point of the game, and what did you learn in making that you might have taken to your next game?
Okay,
What was Mad Maze about? Yeah.
So Mad Maze was essentially your standard fantasy adventure. The basic setting was there was the Mad God's maze, and essentially the Mad God had said to the elders of your village, basically, unless you give us a sacrifice or someone who will run to the end of it, we're going to basically go and take all the young people in your village. So your job is to go in and save your village. Um, and essentially, you do in mazes you have to get through, and of course, things get harder and harder. The mazes get more complex as you go in. So essentially, it was, again, I came up with the original design in 82, 83. We had not seen the whole generation of things like this. The only thing that was close to it was things like that were professional, were things like the Infocom adventures, and even that was a bunch. So a couple of things one of the most important lessons that came out of it was just how powerful community was. Within 3, 4 years of Mad Maze hitting the million mark, I was able to tell the America Online executives, you do not appreciate the value of a community that forms online. It has enormous staying power. And a lesson that came directly from Mad Maze was when they shut down Rabbit Jack's Casino, which was one of the most popular things on AOL, a series of very simple games that people wanted to play. They figured everyone would go away. That community, the people who occupied the boards, stayed at half the peak level for 9 months after they shut down the game. They still kept coming there despite the game being shut down. So one of the most important lessons was the power of community. I wanted to do something that only someone who was young and wanted to show us how smart he was could do. Basically, when you get to the end of the Mad Maze, if you get through all levels, which by the way takes many hours, but not many people do, you discover that you're given a choice by the Mad God or priest, which is either to accept this service, or to basically go away, you bother us. If you say I'm not going to accept the service, he basically blows you up into atoms. And if you do accept a service, of course, you pervert the thing. The thing is part a deal that your elders made to do it. So it was basically a real downer ending, and I thought it was very clever. And actually, people who played for a while gave me credit for it because they liked so much the journey rather than the destination.
Mhm.
But the other thing,
Okay.
the other thing I took is the value of story. It was not it was not the best game design I've ever done. It was a perfectly serviceable design, but by making stories at the right level, and here's something I picked up from Tales of the Arabian Nights: the right length with the right level of color, with actually trying to do narrative and basically have actions have consequences and have people affected, having a few recurring characters, having something that was a semi-consistent story. I mean, again, it was your standard Northern European fantasy mashup, just like Dungeons and Dragons and everything else. But again, there were a number of lessons. There's some more, but there's some more lessons. But those were probably I'm going to stop there because you want to get to some other
We're
questions.
running out of time. Well, do you have an all-time favorite game?
Um, let's see. I do and I don't. I get asked this question on favorite albums by especially my daughters, and I keep coming back to Quadrophenia by The Who, which is just because I have to have an answer. But it's not true. Same with movies. I don't even have an answer. So in games, I might say Stratomatic Baseball, and the reason is I played in a Stratomatic League from when I was for 47 years before I stepped down, and that was only recently because I had a startup, because I have now teenage daughters, and because my parents need help, and because I was actually having some of my board games were published, so something I had to give. But for 47 years, I played with other people. So it was a community of people who I played face to face. It became more Zoom once the pandemic hit. That's how we kept the league
Exactly.
going.
Yeah.
I can list other favorite games, but I'll probably choose that just because to play a game for 45, 47 years, there aren't many D&D campaigns that last that long. And
Yeah.
I'll list it. And in fact, I did a write-up in the 100 Classic Games collection that James Lauder put together. I did the entry on Stratomatic Baseball. But I'll name the other game that I was going to do that I just couldn't finish, so somebody else took it, which is Steve Jackson's Illuminati,
Yeah.
which I think is a truly brilliant game. And by the way, the problem is that when Steve redid the new edition and I introduced my daughter to it, his humor was just right for 1982. When he redid it in 2000 and whatever it was, the fact that he was no longer 20 something, he was 60 something showed. I've said this to Steve, so it's not like I'm revealing this to something else. Favorite computer games? All right, I'm going to name Tristan Pinball. There have been many pinball games. It was for the Mac
Yeah.
too, but it was the one that I liked, and it basically it meant that I would screw up keyboards because there were only two or three things we have to do. Sid Meier's Pirates, not the current version, but his second edition Pirates. I think it is a better game than Civilization, and so on and so forth. I mean, I'll just name them, but you'll notice that these are games that are around. It's just like every other popular media. When people look at what are your favorite movies, they tend to be what
Yeah.
you watch between 15 and 22. Absolutely, almost without exception. So I'm listing games that go back to when I was 30
Yeah.
or young, that I encountered when I was 30 or younger. Sorry,
Yeah.
Pirates was I was in my 30s.
I am in a D&D game that goes back to 1978. I think you need that. And same folks. I went to high school with them. Uh, when the
Rick,
pandemic came, we
Rick,
switched it to
Rick,
online.
Rick, stop torturing me.
What?
If I agree with
Yeah.
you, that means
Yeah.
I have to play for 47 years. I'm too old. My life expectancy does not allow me to do what you did. So you're saying I cannot have the joy that you had, and I think it's very cruel on your part.
That's wonderful. When D&D 3.0 came out, we volunteered to help beta test it when they were developing it. And they assigned us to Forgotten Realms Handbook, which was not what we wanted. We were more a Greyhawk group, but they put it in there, and my name's in the tester credits in the back, and I'm inordinately proud of that. And the rest of
Okay,
my
well,
group is in there too. Anyway,
so don't play D&D 5, 5e, play D&D 3. get the Rick Reynolds edition. I've got 1 minute before I have to hop. So can you give
Yeah,
me a last
yeah.
question?
Go ahead, sir. Yeah. Oh, um, and just if you have any advice for someone who's trying to get in the industry, because Jehu's here, Jehu 81 is saying, look, I've been a hobbyist. I want to break in. I'm working on a lot of UX UI projects, but I join every game jam I can and any Unity contests. Loved it since I was a kid. He wants to any advice for Jehu.
I can't do that in 60 seconds. The shortest version is um, basically figure out how to get a prototype. The most important thing. Okay, I'll give you something else. Um, Visuals are extraordinarily important. I say this because I obviously had game design talent, or at least the ability to make games from a very early age. Um, and a colleague said to me, even though my graphic skills suck. I mean, I like to say that the limits of my accomplishment are drawing a straight line with a ruler, and that's on my good days. But I made sure that I had to learn how to do visuals, and my game designs improved, even though I did terrible. I did very primitively done visuals. So do a prototype, figure out what your weakness is, and try and address it. Don't try and overcompensate for it, but try and address it, because then you will figure out what the weakness is in your game design. Rick and everybody who's participating in the
Thank
channel,
you.
thank you so much for having me. But I'm going to have to disappear to a meeting.
Do us a favor for a second. Stay on camera while Thomas takes us out. Thank you very much, Thomas. You can do your shutdown stuff. And thank you very much to Larrick Dax for playing the game behind us so people had things to look at while listening to us. And Eric, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I may ask
Take
you
care.
to come back again someday in the
Okay,
future.
thanks. I would be delighted. Take care.